The snow had long since soaked through Maya's cloak, turning the heavy wool into a frozen weight that dragged at her shoulders with every staggering step. She pressed one hand against the enormous swell of her belly, feeling the 5 distinct heartbeats that fluttered beneath her palm like trapped birds, and forced her legs to keep moving through the knee-deep drifts. Behind her, somewhere in the howling darkness of the blizzard, the Shadowmere wolves were still hunting. Even after 7 months, the memory of Caleb's blood hadn't faded, the wet heat of it splashing across her face, the sickening crunch of his spine as Vance Shadowmere, Caleb's own brother, the pack's war leader, had snapped his neck with casual brutality. She still wore the same forest green cloak she'd fled in, now worn thin from months of running. Her mate, her first mate, the gentle healer who had loved her despite her quiet wolf, who had wept with joy when the impossible pregnancy had taken hold, had died 7 months ago with her name on his lips. His own brother had killed him, silencing the questions Caleb had been asking about corruption in the pack's finances, and the betrayal of blood had cut as deep as the murder itself. "Run," he had gasped that night 7 months ago, blood bubbling between his teeth. "Maya, run. Protect our—" He hadn't finished the sentence. Vance's boot had crushed his throat before he could say children, and Maya had run for 7 months through villages that didn't ask questions, through territories that wouldn't harbor a Shadowmere fugitive, until finally the hunters had found her trail again. Maya stumbled over a hidden root and went down hard on her knees, the impact sending a bolt of pain through her swollen body that made her cry out. The sound was swallowed immediately by the screaming wind, but she clamped her teeth together anyway, terror clawing at her chest. They were close. She could feel them. 3 wolves, maybe 4. Their hunting howls threading through the storm like promises of death. "Get up," she commanded herself, fingers digging into the snow as she fought to rise. "Get up, get up. They're coming. They'll kill the babies. They'll rip them from your body and leave you to bleed out in the snow just like they did to Caleb." The thought of her children, her impossible, miraculous quintuplets that no healer had believed could exist, gave her the strength to stagger upright again. 7 months pregnant with 5 lives inside her, and she was all that stood between them and the monsters who had already murdered their father. She had to keep moving. She had to find shelter, find help, find something. But there was nothing, only the endless white of the blizzard, the black shapes of winter bare trees, and the ancient border stones that she had passed an hour ago, the ones carved with warnings in the old tongue that she had been too desperate to heed. She had crossed into forbidden territory, Windrider lands, where no outsider had been welcomed in 5 years, where the reclusive Alpha King was said to execute trespassers on sight. Better a quick death from him than what Vance will do to me, Maya thought, and the bitter laugh that escaped her cracked lips sounded more like a sob. Better anything than watching them cut my children out of me one by one while I scream. That was what Lady Vera had promised, after all. The beautiful noblewoman who had come to Shadowmere as an ambassador from some distant territory, who had taken one look at Maya's pregnant belly and smiled a smile that hadn't reached her cold silver eyes. She had whispered something to Lord Vance, and within the hour Caleb was dead, and Maya was running for her life. Cursed bloodline, Vera had called it. Abomination. Those pups will bring doom upon every pack foolish enough to shelter them. Maya hadn't stopped to ask what she meant. She had simply run, clutching her belly and praying to the moon goddess for a miracle she didn't deserve. Now, as her legs finally gave out completely, and she collapsed against one of the ancient border stones, she wondered if perhaps Vera had been right. Perhaps the quintuplets were cursed. Perhaps that was why Maya's wolf had gone dormant the moment Caleb died, the beast inside her simply surrendering to grief, accepting the inevitability of death rather than fighting for a future that had been stolen before it could begin. Her wolf had always been quiet, never as strong as other she-wolves, But after the mating bond shattered, even that quiet presence had faded to near silence. 7 months of running, of hiding in villages that didn't ask questions, of scraping together enough to eat while her belly grew, and through it all, her wolf had offered nothing but the faintest flicker of survival instinct. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the lives inside her, her frozen fingers tracing patterns over her belly as the snow continued to fall. She could feel them moving, restless and frightened, somehow sensing their mother's despair even from the safety of her womb. "I'm so sorry. I tried. I tried to get us somewhere safe. I tried." A howl split the night, close enough that Maya could hear the triumphant note in it. They had found her. She pressed her back against the border stone and drew the small knife from her belt. The one Caleb had given her on their mating day, the blade engraved with healing runes that seemed to mock her now. It wouldn't save her. Nothing would save her. But she would make them work for her death, would carve at least one of them before the end, would. Another howl answered the first, but this one came from ahead of her rather than behind. And then another, and another. And then the trees ahead of her exploded with wolves, massive creatures, larger than any she had ever seen, their pelts a stunning mix of silver and storm gray that seemed to glow even in the darkness of the blizzard. They formed a line between Maya and the direction of the Shadowmere howls, hackles raised, teeth bared, and the lead wolf, a scarred male with one milky eye, turned to look at her with an expression that was almost confused. Maya raised her knife with a hand that wouldn't stop shaking. "Stay away from me." The wolf's head tilted. Then, impossibly, it shifted. Bones cracking and reforming, fur receding into bare skin, until a man stood before her instead. He was older, perhaps 50, with the same milky eye and a face mapped with battle scars. He wore only loose trousers despite the freezing cold, and when he spoke, his voice was gruff, but not unkind. "Easy, little mother. We're not Shadowmere." He took a step toward her, hands raised in a gesture of peace. "I'm called Bran. I lead the Windrider Border Patrol. We heard the hunting howls and came to investigate." Maya didn't lower the knife. She couldn't. Her fingers had frozen around the hilt, and her vision was starting to blur at the edges from cold and exhaustion, and the relentless strain of carrying 5 lives through a winter storm. "I crossed into your territory. I know the law. Just make it quick. Please. For my children." Something in Bran's expression shifted. His gaze dropped to her belly, and his single working eye widened with shock. "Moon's mercy," he breathed. "How many are you carrying?" "5." The word came out as barely a whisper. "I know. I know it's impossible. No one believed. The healers said I was lying, or mad, or... But they're real. They're real. And they're all I have left. And please, please, if there's any mercy in your Alpha's heart, let my children live even if I..." She didn't finish the sentence. The darkness that had been creeping at the edges of her vision finally rushed in, and the last thing Maya heard before consciousness fled was Bran's voice, sharp with urgency. "Get the healer! Someone ride ahead and tell the king. We're bringing him in a pregnant widow about to drop a whole damned litter." Maya woke to warmth. For a long moment she simply lay still, convinced that she had died in the snow, and this was the moon goddess's mercy, an afterlife where her body didn't ache, where her fingers weren't frozen, where soft furs cradled her instead of ice. Then one of the babies kicked, hard enough to make her gasp, and reality came rushing back with painful clarity. She was alive. She was warm. She was lying in a bed, a real bed, with actual mattresses and pillows and furs piled so deep she felt like she was floating. The room around her was dim, lit only by the flickering glow of a fire somewhere to her left, and it smelled of healing herbs and wood smoke and something else. something wild and crisp that made her dormant wolf stir for the first time since Caleb's death. Pine, her wolf whispered, and the single word was more than Maya had heard from her beast in 7 months. Storm. Safety. Maya's hand flew to her throat, pressing against the silent place where her bond with Caleb had once thrummed with life. It was still dead, still that awful echoing emptiness that had replaced the warm connection she'd grown used to over 5 years of mating. But her wolf was awake. Barely. Flickering like a candle in the wind, but awake. And that shouldn't have been possible. A mated wolf whose partner died went dormant until death. Everyone knew that. It was simply how the bond worked. So why was her wolf stirring now? Because he's coming, her wolf breathed, and Maya didn't have time to ask what that meant before the door opened. She saw his silhouette first. Impossibly broad shoulders, height that had to top 6.5 feet. The suggestion of powerful muscle beneath simple dark clothing. He moved with the silent grace of a predator, each step controlled and purposeful, and Maya's heart began to pound so hard she could feel it in her throat. Then he stepped into the firelight, and she stopped breathing entirely. He was scarred. That was the first thing she registered. A map of old wounds across the left side of his face, pulling at his eye and the corner of his mouth, disappearing beneath the collar of his shirt to suggest damage that continued far beyond what she could see. His hair was dark, almost black, shot through with early gray at the temples, and his jaw was shadowed with several days' worth of stubble. But his eyes, Moon's mercy, his eyes, they were gold. Pure, molten gold, like coins fresh from a forge, like autumn leaves caught in sunlight, like nothing Maya had ever seen in her entire life. They swept over her with an intensity that made her skin prickle, cataloging every detail. Her tangled dark hair, her hollow cheeks, the way her hands had instinctively curved over her belly in protection. He opened his mouth to speak, clearly prepared to demand answers about this trespasser in his territory. And then his gaze locked with hers. Heat. It exploded through Maya's chest like wildfire, like lightning, like nothing she had ever felt. Not even with Caleb. Not even during their mating ceremony when the moon goddess had blessed their bond. This was different. This was more. It burned through her veins and set every nerve ending alight. And her wolf, her dormant, grieving, half-dead wolf, suddenly threw back her head and howled. Him, her wolf screamed, the sound echoing through Maya's entire being with desperate recognition. This is what we were waiting for. This is why we survived. Our true mate. No, Maya whispered, shaking her head even as her skin tingled everywhere his gaze touched, even as her body swayed toward him like a flower seeking sun. No, that's not. I was already mated. This isn't possible. This can't be. But the Alpha King wasn't listening. He had gone completely still in the doorway, his massive frame frozen mid-step, and as Maya watched with mounting terror, his eyes flared even brighter, molten gold shifting to something that burned almost white. A growl escaped his throat, low and rumbling and primal, and she saw his hands fly to the doorframe, fingers gripping the wood so hard that it cracked beneath his grip. Mate. Her wolf keened, the word echoing through her like a heartbeat. Be quiet, Maya gasped, unsure if she was speaking to her wolf or to him or to the universe itself. Please, be quiet. This isn't... I can't... The Alpha King took a single step toward her, and the air between them seemed to crackle with electricity. Maya could smell him now, pine and ozone, like a forest before a storm, wild and clean and devastatingly right. And her treacherous body responded without her permission, heat pooling low in her belly, her skin flushing despite the impossibility of everything happening. Who are you? His voice was rough, scraped raw, as if the words were being torn from his throat. What is your name? Maya, She couldn't lie to him. She couldn't even think about lying to him. Maya Darkhollow, please. I know I trespassed. I know the law. But please, my children. Maya. He repeated her name like it was a prayer, like it was a curse, like it was the answer to a question he had been asking for his entire life. His eyes dropped to her belly, and something in his expression shattered. You're pregnant. 7 months, quintuplets. She was babbling now, panic and confusion and the impossible heat of the bond making her words tumble over each other. My mate. He was killed 7 months ago. The Shadowmere Pack. They murdered him. They've been hunting me ever since. They want to... They said the bloodline was cursed, that the babies would bring doom, and I ran. I didn't know where else to go. 7 months. The Alpha King's voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper, and his golden eyes were fixed on her face with an intensity that made her shiver. You've been running for 7 months, and your wolf is still awake. Maya's hand flew to her throat again, pressing against the empty place where the bond scar had once marked her as Caleb's. He's dead. The bond broke when he died. I felt it break. But your wolf, the Alpha King said slowly, taking another step toward her, close enough now that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. Your wolf should have gone dormant. A mated wolf whose partner dies sleeps until death. Everyone knows that. Yet I can feel her stirring. How is that possible? She did, Maya wanted to say. She was silent for 7 months, barely a flicker of life inside me. But that wasn't true anymore. Her wolf was awake now, straining toward this scarred stranger with desperate recognition, howling words that Maya wouldn't let herself understand. Who are you? She whispered. His lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. Fenris Windrider, Alpha King of this territory. He was close enough to touch now, close enough that Maya had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely audible above the crackling of the fire. And I believe, little mother, that you and I have a great deal to discuss. Maya's breath caught in her throat as Fenris Windrider held her gaze, the heat between them building with every heartbeat until she felt certain she would combust from it. Her wolf was still howling inside her skull, a desperate keening that drowned out rational thought, and she had to grip the furs beneath her fingers just to anchor herself to reality. I don't understand, she managed, her voice barely more than a whisper. I was mated. The bond was complete. Caleb and I, we had 5 years together. This shouldn't be possible. Fenris hadn't moved from where he stood, but she could see the tension coiled in every line of his massive frame. His hands were still at his sides, fingers flexing and releasing as if he was fighting the urge to reach for her, and his golden eyes hadn't left her face for even a second. There are stories, he said slowly, his rough voice sending shivers down her spine that had nothing to do with cold. Ancient stories, from before the packs were formalized, about wolves who were born with more than one potential mate. The moon goddess's chosen, blessed or cursed, depending on who tells the tale. Maya shook her head, pressing her hand harder against her belly as the babies stirred restlessly beneath her palm. They could feel it too, she realized. And more than that, she felt a strange warmth pulse through her skin where they kicked, a silvery sensation that made her breath catch. The bond recognition. The impossible pull toward this scarred stranger who looked at her like she was the answer to every prayer he'd ever whispered in the dark. I'm not blessed, she said, and the bitter laugh that escaped her cracked lips sounded more like a sob. If anything, I'm cursed. My children are being hunted. My mate is dead. I crossed into forbidden territory because I had nowhere else to run. I can't be... She didn't know how to finish the sentence. She didn't know what she was trying to deny, the bond she could feel pulling at her like invisible threads, or the way her wolf had gone from dormant to desperately alive in the space of a single breath. Fenris took another step toward her, and Maya's heart stuttered in her chest. He was close now, so close that she could see the individual scars that mapped the left side of his face, could count the threads of gray at his temples, could feel the heat radiating from his body like a furnace. His scent surrounded her, pine and ozone, wilderness and storm, and her wolf rolled inside her with shameless longing. "What do you feel?" Fenris asked, his voice dropping to something barely above a growl. "Right now, in this moment, what does your wolf tell you?" Maya's throat tightened. She could lie. She could deny it. Could claim that her wolf was still dormant. Could pretend that the heat flooding through her veins was nothing more than fever from her ordeal. But when she opened her mouth, the truth spilled out instead. "She says you're mine." The words were barely audible, torn from somewhere deep in her chest. "She says you're what we've been waiting for. She says—" Maya's voice broke, and she had to look away from those burning golden eyes before she lost herself entirely. "She says, mate." The sound Fenris made then wasn't quite human. It was a rumble that started somewhere deep in his chest and vibrated through the air between them, a sound of recognition and claiming and fierce, desperate want. Maya's gaze snapped back to his face just in time to watch his eyes flare white gold, brighter than she'd ever seen, and his sharp inhale was audible even over the crackling of the fire. "Mine," he breathed, and the single word carried the weight of prophecy. Then his hand moved, slowly, carefully, giving her every opportunity to pull away, and his fingers brushed against her cheek. The contact was like touching lightning. Heat seared through Maya's entire body, starting from the point where his calloused fingertips met her skin and spreading outward in a wave that left her gasping. Her wolf howled in triumph, and somewhere in the depths of her being, she felt something click into place. Not a full bond, not yet, but the promise of one, the potential, the beginning. Fenris's hand was trembling against her face. She could feel the fine tremors running through his massive frame, could see the way his jaw had gone tight with barely controlled emotion. He was holding himself back, she realized, fighting the instinct to claim her completely, to mark her, to make the bond permanent right here and now. "I should leave," he said roughly, even as his thumb traced the curve of her cheekbone with devastating tenderness. "You're injured, exhausted, pregnant with another male's children. The last thing you need is—" "Don't." The word escaped before Maya could stop it, and she was horrified to feel tears burning at the corners of her eyes. "Please, don't go." She didn't know why she said it. She didn't know why the thought of him leaving made her chest ache with something perilously close to despair. She had known this man for less than 5 minutes. He was a stranger, an alpha king who could still decide to execute her for trespassing, and she was carrying her dead mate's children. This was madness. This was impossible. This was the most real thing she had ever felt in her entire life. Fenris's golden eyes searched her face for a long moment, and Maya had the uncomfortable sensation that he was seeing straight through to her soul. Then, slowly, he withdrew his hand from her cheek, and the loss of contact made her want to cry out. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, his voice still rough but gentler now, soft in a way she wouldn't have expected from a male of his size and power. "I'm going to sit in that chair by the fire, and I'm going to stay here until my healer arrives to examine you. And then, we're going to talk about what happens next." His lips curved into something that was almost a smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Is that acceptable to you, little mother?" Maya didn't trust her voice to answer, so she simply nodded. She watched as Fenris moved to the chair he'd indicated, a heavy wooden thing that looked like it had been carved from a single massive tree trunk, and lowered himself into it with the careful grace of a predator at rest. He didn't take his eyes off her the entire time, and even from across the room, she could feel the weight of his attention like a physical touch. Her wolf had finally stopped howling, but she was still awake, still alert, still straining toward the scarred alpha with desperate longing. Mate, she whispered inside Maya's mind, the word as soft and warm as a caress. He's ours. He won't hurt us. He'll protect the pups. Maya wanted to argue. She wanted to point out that they didn't know this male, that he could still be dangerous, that the Shadowmere wolves were still hunting them, and 5 minutes of overwhelming attraction didn't change the fact that she was a pregnant widow with no pack, no resources, and no reason to trust anyone. But when she looked at Fenris Windrider, at the scars that mapped his face, at the gray in his dark hair, at the golden eyes that watched her with such fierce, barely leashed intensity, she couldn't make herself believe that he meant her harm. For the first time since Caleb's death 7 months ago, Maya felt something that might have been hope. The healer who arrived 20 minutes later was a small, round woman with silver-streaked hair and sharp brown eyes that missed nothing. She introduced herself as Marin, and she spent the next hour examining Maya with a thoroughness that left no part of her unassessed, listening to her heart, measuring the size of her belly, pressing careful hands against her swollen abdomen to feel the position of each baby. Through it all, Fenris remained in his chair by the fire. He didn't speak. He didn't interfere. He simply watched, his golden eyes tracking every movement Marin made, and somehow his silent presence was more comforting than any words could have been. 5 heartbeats, Marin announced finally, sitting back on her heels with an expression of frank amazement. Strong ones, too. However you've managed this, girl, those pups are healthy. She paused, frowning, her hand still hovering over Maya's belly. There's something else, a resonance I don't quite understand, like they're drawing on something, channeling power from somewhere deep. I've never felt anything like it. Maya's eyes filled with tears she was too exhausted to fight. They're really all right? After everything, the running, the cold, the stress. They're all right? Better than all right? Marin patted her hand with gruff gentleness. They're fighters, like their mother. Now. She turned to look at Fenris, and Maya was surprised to see no fear in the older woman's face, only a kind of fond exasperation. She needs rest, majesty, real rest, not a few hours snatched between interrogations. The next 2 months will be critical for those pups, and she can't spend them worrying about whether she's going to be thrown out into the snow. She's not going anywhere, Fenris said quietly, and something in his voice made Maya's breath catch. She's under my protection now. Marin studied him for a long moment, something knowing flickering in her sharp eyes. Then she nodded once and began packing up her supplies. I'll return in the morning to check on her again. Make sure she eats something before she sleeps. She's half-starved from the look of her. She paused at the door, looking back at Maya with an expression that might have been sympathy. You're safe here, child. Whatever else happens, you can believe that much. Then she was gone, and Maya was alone with the Alpha King again. The silence stretched between them, weighted with everything that had happened and everything that remained unsaid. Maya watched Fenris across the flickering firelight, trying to reconcile the terrifying rumors she'd heard about the Windrider Alpha with the male who had sat quietly beside her for an hour, who had promised her protection without asking for anything in return. You should sleep, Fenris said finally, his voice low enough that she had to strain to hear it. Marin wasn't wrong about your exhaustion. I know. But Maya didn't close her eyes. She couldn't. Every time she did, she saw Caleb's face, saw the blood bubbling between his teeth, heard the wet crunch of his spine breaking, felt the bond between them shatter like glass. I'm afraid to. She hadn't meant to admit that. The words escaped before she could stop them, and she felt her face heat with shame. She was a grown woman, a widow, a mother 5 times over. She shouldn't be afraid to close her eyes. But Fenris didn't mock her, didn't tell her to be strong, didn't dismiss her fear as weakness. He simply leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms over his broad chest. "Then I'll stay," he said. "I'll be right here when you wake up. Nothing will touch you while I'm in this room." It was such a simple promise, such a small thing, really. Just the offer of presence, of witness, of protection, while she was at her most vulnerable. Maya had no reason to believe him. She had no reason to trust a single word that came out of his scarred mouth. But her wolf believed him. And for tonight, that was enough. Maya let her eyes flutter closed, and for the first time in 7 months, she slept without dreaming of blood. She woke screaming. The nightmare came anyway. Not the blood or the bone this time, but the sound. The wet crunch of Caleb's spine breaking under Lord Vance's hands. The gurgling gasp of his last breath. The triumphant howl of the Shadowmere wolves as they scented her fear and began their hunt. Maya's eyes flew open, and her hands went immediately to her belly, pressing against the familiar weight of her children as sobs tore from her throat. The room was dark except for the dying embers of the fire, and for one terrible moment she didn't know where she was. Didn't know if she was back in the snow, if the wolves had found her, if everything since her collapse at the border stones had been nothing but a fever dream. Then she smelled pine and ozone, and Fenris was there. He didn't touch her. Even in the chaos of her terror, she registered that. The way he stopped at the edge of her bed, close enough that his scent surrounded her, but not so close that he invaded her space. His golden eyes were bright in the darkness, fixed on her face with an intensity that should have been frightening but somehow wasn't. "You're safe," he said, his rough voice pitched low and steady, an anchor in the storm of her panic. "You're in my stronghold, in the healing ward. No one can reach you here." Maya's hands trembled against her belly. "Caleb, I saw him. I heard. I know." Fenris's voice didn't waver, didn't soften into meaningless comfort. But there was something in it that made her chest ache. Understanding, perhaps. Recognition of a grief he couldn't fix but wouldn't dismiss. "I know. But that was then. And this is now. And you're alive. Your children are alive. And nothing is going to change that." He moved then, not toward her, but toward the chair he'd occupied earlier. The one by the fire, close enough that she could see him from the bed. He sank into it with the same controlled grace she'd noticed before, and his golden gaze never left her face. "Sleep," he said simply. "I'm not going anywhere." Maya wanted to argue. She wanted to tell him that she didn't need a babysitter, that she was perfectly capable of handling her own nightmares, that she didn't want to be pitied or coddled or treated like she might shatter at any moment. But she was so tired. Bone deep, exhausted in a way she hadn't allowed herself to acknowledge while she was running for her life. And Fenris's presence, his steady breathing, the warm weight of his scent in the air, the promise of protection that hummed between them like a half-formed bond, made her feel safer than she had any right to feel. She didn't say anything. She just let her eyes close again and focused on the sound of his heartbeat until the darkness pulled her under. When she woke the second time, hours later, he was still there, still watching, still waiting. Something in Maya's chest cracked open at the sight of him. This scarred, terrifying alpha king who had spent the entire night sitting in an uncomfortable chair just so she wouldn't wake up alone. Her wolf purred with satisfaction, but Maya pushed the sensation aside. She wasn't ready to examine what it meant. She wasn't ready to admit that she was already starting to trust him. The next few days passed in a blur of sleep and healing, punctuated by Marin's brisk visits and the ever-present weight of Fenris's attention. He came twice each day, once in the morning and once in the evening, and each time he sat in the same chair by the fire and asked her questions in his low, careful voice. Not demanding questions, not interrogation. just quiet inquiries about her health, about the babies, about what she needed. He brought her books from his personal library when she admitted she was bored. He arranged for fresh clothing to be delivered, soft dresses that accommodated her pregnant belly, warm shawls against the lingering chill. He never touched her again after that first night, but his presence surrounded her like a protective embrace. It should have been suspicious. It probably was suspicious. Some part of her insisted. No male was this careful, this considerate, without wanting something in return. But every time she searched Fenris's face for evidence of ulterior motives, all she found was that same fierce, barely leashed intensity. Like she was the most important thing in his world. Like protecting her had become his only purpose. Maya didn't know what to do with that, so she did nothing. Just accepted his care without comment and tried not to think about the way her wolf sang every time he walked through the door. On the fourth day, Marin declared her well enough to leave the healing ward. Fenris arrived that evening with news that made Maya's heart stop in her chest. The Shadowmere wolves sent an envoy, he said, his voice flat and dangerous. Lord Vance demands your return. He claims you stole something valuable from his pack. The blood drained from Maya's face. I didn't steal anything. I ran because they murdered my mate and were going to... She couldn't finish the sentence. Her hand flew to her belly, pressing protectively against the lives inside her. Please, please don't send me back. Fenris's golden eyes went molten. I wasn't planning to. He moved closer, and for the first time since that first night, his hand reached toward her face. He stopped before he touched her, though, his fingers hovering a breath away from her cheek. But I need to present you to my court. Formally. If you're going to remain under my protection, they need to know why. Maya didn't understand what he meant until the next evening, when servants arrived to dress her in midnight blue velvet, and Fenris escorted her into the great hall of his stronghold. The room was massive, stone walls hung with tapestries depicting wolf hunts and lunar ceremonies, a roaring fire in a hearth large enough to roast a whole ox, and at least 100 wolves in human form arranged along both sides of a central aisle. They watched her with expressions ranging from curious to hostile, and Maya had to fight the urge to shrink behind Fenris's broad back. Chin up, her wolf commanded, and for once, Maya obeyed. She walked beside the Alpha King with her hand resting on her pregnant belly, and she met every stare with quiet defiance. Let them judge her. Judge. Let them whisper about the widow who had stumbled into their territory half dead and pregnant with another male's children. She had survived worse than their disapproval. But when they reached the head of the hall, where a massive throne carved from dark wood sat empty on a raised dais, a voice rang out that stopped Fenris in his tracks. Forgive me, Majesty, but are we certain this is wise? The speaker was an older male with iron-gray hair and the hard-muscled build of a warrior. He stood near the front of the crowd, and though his words were polite, there was something in his eyes that made Maya's wolf bristle with warning. She arrived in our territory half dead, alone, with no pack and no resources. She claims to carry quintuplets, which, as we all know, is impossible. No wolf has carried 5 pups successfully in over 300 years. He paused, letting the murmurs spread through the crowd. Is it not possible that she lies? That she seeks to take advantage of your protection by claiming something fantastical enough to capture your interest? Fenris went very still beside her. Maya could feel the tension radiating from his body, could see the way his hands had curled into fists at his sides. But before he could respond, another voice cut through the murmurs, this one female, high and sweet and poison-laced. Perhaps she isn't lying about the pregnancy itself. Perhaps she merely lies about the father. The crowd parted to reveal the speaker, and Maya's blood ran cold. Lady Vera Starfall stood in the center of the hall, her silver blonde hair cascading over her shoulders, her cold silver eyes fixed on Maya with barely concealed hatred. She was dressed in white silk that clung to her willowy frame, and the smile on her perfect lips didn't reach her eyes. After all, Vera continued, her voice carrying through the suddenly silent hall, it seems quite convenient, doesn't it? A widow from an enemy pack appears at our border just as the Shadowmere wolves begin their hunt. Carrying children, she claims, are miracles, attracting the attention of our reclusive king. One might almost think it was planned. The growl that escaped Fenris's throat shook the air of the hall. Maya saw several wolves flinch back from the sound, saw Vera's smile flicker for just a moment before she schooled her expression back into sweet concern. "I mean no disrespect, Majesty," Vera said, dropping into a curtsy that put her low-cut bodice on full display. "I merely voice the concerns that others are too cautious to speak. We have all heard the old prophecies about cursed bloodlines and doom brought upon packs foolish enough to shelter them. Is it not our duty to consider enough?" Fenris's voice was ice and iron, cutting through Vera's words like a blade. He stepped forward, putting himself between Maya and the crowd, and when he spoke again, his words resonated with the full weight of his alpha power. "This woman is under my protection. Her children are under my protection. Anyone who questions that questions me." His golden eyes swept the hall, and Maya saw wolf after wolf drop their gaze in submission. 3 healers will arrive from neighboring territories within the week to confirm the pregnancy. Until then, Maya Darkhollow is an honored guest of this court. He paused, and his next words were directed at Vera alone. "And if anyone speaks against her again without evidence to support their accusations, they will answer to me personally." The hall fell absolutely silent. Vera's face had gone pale beneath her perfect makeup, and though her smile remained fixed in place, Maya could see the fury burning in her silver eyes. She was trying to turn them against me, Maya realized, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted them to throw me out before I could. Before Fenris could. Before Fenris could what? Claim her? The thought sent a complicated wave of heat and fear and longing through Maya's chest, and she had to look away from the crowd before they saw it on her face. Then Fenris's hand touched the small of her back, the first time he'd touched her since that first night, and his voice dropped to a murmur meant only for her ears. "I'm having a wing of the stronghold prepared for you. Your own chambers, your own staff, everything you need to bring your children safely into the world." His breath was warm against her temple, and she felt herself leaning into his touch despite her better judgment. "You're not alone anymore, Maya. I'm going to take care of you." She should have questioned it, should have demanded to know why he was doing all this for a stranger, what he expected in return, what angle he was playing. But when she looked up into his golden eyes and saw nothing but fierce, protective determination looking back at her, the questions died on her tongue. For the first time since Caleb's death, Maya let herself believe that she might actually survive this, and when Fenris's hand pressed more firmly against her back, guiding her away from the watching crowd and toward the new life he was building for her, she let herself follow. The wing Fenris had promised was more than Maya had dared to imagine. She followed him through corridors that grew progressively quieter, the sounds of the great hall fading behind them until all she could hear was the soft padding of their footsteps and the distant howl of wind against the stronghold's ancient stones. Her heart was still racing from the confrontation with Vera, her mind replaying the moment Fenris had stepped between her and the crowd, the way his alpha power had filled the room like a living thing. "He defended me." The thought kept circling back, insistent and warm. He didn't have to. He could have let them question me, could have demanded proof before extending his protection. But he didn't. "The construction isn't complete," Fenris said, breaking the silence as they turned down a corridor lit by torches that burned with an unusual blue-white flame. But the main chambers are habitable. I've assigned a team to work through the nights to finish the rest before your children come. Maya's hand drifted to her belly, feeling the familiar shift and press of the babies within. You didn't have to do this. I would have been fine in the healing ward, or even, you wouldn't have been fine. His voice was gentle but firm, and when he glanced back at her, she saw something vulnerable flicker in his golden eyes. The healing ward is too exposed. Too many people coming and going. Too many opportunities for those who wish you harm to find their way to your bedside. Here. He stopped before a set of double doors carved with intricate wolf motifs, pressing his palm against the wood until she heard a soft click. Here, you're safe. The doors swung open, and Maya's breath caught in her throat. The chamber beyond was enormous, easily 3 times the size of the cottage she'd shared with Caleb in Shadowmere. Massive windows dominated the far wall, looking out over a snow-covered courtyard that glittered in the moonlight like scattered diamonds. The ceiling arched high overhead, painted with scenes of wolves running beneath a full moon, and a fire crackled in a hearth large enough for her to stand inside without ducking. But it was the details that made her eyes sting with unexpected tears. A bed piled high with furs and quilts, positioned near the fire for warmth. A rocking chair beside the window, its armrests worn smooth from use. And along the far wall, 5 cradles, each one carved from pale wood and lined with the softest wool she'd ever touched. 5, she whispered, her voice catching. You had them make 5. Fenris had stopped just inside the doorway, watching her with an intensity that made her skin prickle with awareness. The healers from the other territories haven't arrived yet, but I had my own healer examine the records from your pack. She found traces of the original diagnosis, buried in documents the Shadowmere wolves tried to destroy. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was rough. 5 heartbeats. She confirmed it this morning. Maya's hand pressed harder against her belly, feeling the flutter and kick of tiny limbs. All these months, no one had believed her. The healers in Shadowmere had called her hysterical, had suggested the pregnancy was making her delusional, had whispered behind her back that Caleb's widow was losing her mind along with her mate. And now, she believed me, Maya said, barely above a whisper. She actually believed me. I believed you from the moment you told me. Fenris's voice was closer now, and when Maya turned, she found him standing just an arm's length away, his scarred face illuminated by firelight. I could hear them, Maya. That first night in the healing ward when I sat with you while you slept. I listened, and I heard 5 separate heartbeats. 5 lives, fighting to survive. His hand rose, hesitated, then gently cupped her cheek. You weren't lying. You weren't delusional. You were a mother protecting her children, and everyone around you was too blind to see what was right in front of them. The tears spilled over then, tracking hot paths down her cheeks. Maya turned her face into his palm, breathing in his scent of pine and winter storms, and for a moment she let herself just feel. Feel his warmth. Feel his certainty. Feel the steady pulse of something she couldn't name thrumming through the bond that stretched between them. This is dangerous, her mind whispered. You barely know him. You don't understand why he's doing this. But her wolf was purring with contentment, and her babies were calm for the first time in weeks. And when Fenris's thumb brushed away her tears with impossible gentleness, Maya couldn't find it in herself to pull away. Rest now, he murmured, and his voice was a rumble that vibrated through her bones. I'll have food sent up. In the morning, we'll discuss what happens next. He released her slowly, reluctantly, his fingers trailing across her jaw before he stepped back toward the door. And as Maya watched him go, she realized with a start that she didn't want him to leave. Fenris. He stopped, one hand on the doorframe, and looked back at her with eyes that glowed faintly gold in the firelight. Thank you, she said softly, for believing me, for for all of this. Something shifted in his expression, something raw and hungry that made Maya's breath catch, but he only nodded once, sharply, before disappearing through the door and pulling it closed behind him. Maya stood in the center of her new chambers for a long moment, one hand on her belly and the other pressed against the warmth that still lingered on her cheek. Then she crossed to the window and looked out at the snow-covered courtyard, watching as a familiar scarred figure emerged from the stronghold below and strode across the white expanse until he reached the edge of the forest. Even from this distance, she could see the tension in his shoulders, the rigid control in every line of his body. He stood at the tree line for a long moment, his head tilted back toward the moon. And then, his form blurred, shifted, and a massive silver wolf stood where the man had been. He threw back his head and howled, the sound piercing and wild and achingly beautiful, and Maya felt an answering cry rise in her own throat. Her wolf, her dormant, silent wolf, the one that had gone quiet the moment Caleb's blood had spilled across their bedroom floor. It was stirring now, pressing against the walls of her consciousness, demanding to be heard. "Mate," it whispered. "Our mate." Maya pressed her forehead against the cold glass and watched the silver wolf pace at the forest's edge, and she wondered if she was strong enough to survive what was coming. Vera Starfall was not a woman accustomed to defeat. 5 years she had lived in this stronghold, 5 years of cultivating alliances with guards and servants and construction crews, 5 years of learning every secret passage and patrol schedule while she waited for Fenris to finally choose her as his queen. Now she stood in her chambers on the opposite side of the stronghold, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, as she replayed the humiliation of the Great Hall over and over in her mind. The way Fenris had stepped in front of that widow, that pregnant interloper with her desperate eyes and her rounded belly. The way his alpha power had rolled through the room, silencing her accusations before she could finish making them. The way he had looked at Maya Darkhollow like she was something precious, something worth protecting. Something he had never looked at Vera. A knock at her door made her spin, her silver eyes narrowing with fury. "What?" she snarled. The door opened to reveal a hooded figure, and Vera's expression shifted from anger to cold calculation as she recognized the scent beneath the cloak. "Vance," she said, her voice dropping to a purr. "I was beginning to think you'd lost your nerve." The Shadowmere warrior pushed back his hood, revealing a face scarred by violence and twisted with hatred. "Getting past your border patrols was more difficult than anticipated. Your precious Alpha King has doubled his guard rotation since the widow arrived." "She's not just any widow." Vera crossed to her dressing table and poured 2 glasses of wine from a crystal decanter, handing one to her guest. "She's carrying quintuplets. 5 children of a bloodline that should have died out with her mate." Vance's eyes widened, and she saw the fear that flickered through them before he masked it. "Quintuplets? That's impossible? Cursed? Prophesied?" Vera took a delicate sip of her wine. "There are old stories, Vance. Very old stories about a Luna who would come to the Windrider pack bearing 5 children of mixed blood, children carrying the ancient silver fire of the moon goddess herself. Stories that say those children would either save the kingdom or destroy it, depending on who claimed their mother as mate. The power that runs through that bloodline is older than the packs themselves. It's why your alpha wanted them destroyed. He recognized the signs." "And you think Fenris means to claim her?" Vera's laugh was sharp and bitter. "I know he does. I've spent 5 years positioning myself as his inevitable queen, and in one night she's undone everything. He's building her a private wing. He's summoning healers from 3 territories. He defended her in front of the entire court, Vance. He never defends anyone." She set her wineglass down and moved closer to the Shadowmere warrior, her voice dropping to a whisper. "But there's still time to stop this. If Maya never becomes his Luna, If she and her children were to disappear, you want us to kill her? It wasn't a question. I want you to do what your pack was already planning to do. Vera's smile was sharp as a blade. You've been hunting her since she crossed the border. I'm simply offering you a way past the defenses that have kept you from finishing the job. Vance's hand tightened around his wineglass. The Windrider stronghold is impenetrable, even with inside help. The new wing has a service entrance that connects to the old kitchens. The construction crews use it to bring in supplies after dark, and the guards there are stretched thin. Vera produced a small brass key from her bodice and held it up, watching the torchlight glint off its surface. This opens the door. I can tell you when the patrols change, when she's most vulnerable, when her precious Alpha King is too occupied with council matters to hear her scream. And what do you get in return? Vera's silver eyes glittered with cold fury. I get to be queen. Her voice wavered just for a moment before hardening again. Do you know what it's like to be promised to someone since birth? To spend your entire life preparing for a role, only to watch it slip away because some pregnant refugee stumbles across the border? My mother died believing I would rule at Fenris's side. My pack invested everything in this alliance. Her silver eyes glittered with something that might have been grief beneath the fury. In a year, maybe 2, I'll have everything I was promised, everything I was owed. Vance studied her for a long moment, and then a slow, cruel smile spread across his scarred face. Your father was right about you, Lady Vera. You're more wolf than woman. My father was a fool who let sentiment cloud his judgment. She pressed the key into Vance's palm and curled his fingers around it. Don't make the same mistake. I want her dead before the full moon, along with those abominations she's carrying. Do you understand? Perfectly. Vera stepped back, smoothing her white silk gown and checking her reflection in the mirror. Her smile was sweet and serene, the smile of a woman who had never plotted murder, never betrayed her alpha, never felt the cold satisfaction of watching her enemies fall. Then we have an agreement, she said softly. Now get out of my chambers before someone sees you. And Vance? She glanced over her shoulder as he moved toward the door. If you fail me, I'll deny ever meeting you, and I'll make sure Fenris knows exactly where to find the Shadowmere wolves who tried to kill his precious widow. The threat hung in the air as Vance slipped out into the corridor, the brass key clutched tight in his fist. Vera turned back to the window, looking out at the snow-covered courtyard where she could see the newly constructed wing rising against the night sky. In one of those rooms, Maya Darkhollow was probably sleeping, probably dreaming of the future Fenris had promised her. Enjoy it while you can, little widow, Vera thought, her reflection smiling back at her with cold satisfaction. Your time is running out. The days that followed were unlike anything Maya had ever experienced. Fenris visited her chambers each morning, ostensibly to check on her health and discuss the progress of the nursery wing's construction. But the visits grew longer with each passing day, the conversation straying from practical matters to something more personal, more intimate. He asked about her childhood in the small pack where she'd been born, about the years she'd spent as Caleb's mate, about her hopes for the children growing inside her. And she found herself answering honestly, sharing pieces of herself that she'd kept locked away since Caleb's death. She told him about the cottage in Shadowmere, about the garden she'd tended and the herbs she'd grown for the pack's healers. She told him about Caleb's kindness, his patience, the way he'd looked at her like she was the center of his world even when their pack demanded more of his attention than he had to give. She told him about the night he died. They came for us after midnight, she said, her voice steady despite the memories clawing at her chest. They were sitting in the rocking chairs by her window, watching the sun set over the mountains, and Fenris's presence beside her was a warm, solid anchor. Caleb knew something was wrong. He'd been worried for weeks, ever since he started questioning the Alpha about the pack's finances. He found something, I think. something the leadership wanted to stay hidden. What did he find? Fenris's voice was soft, but she could hear the steel beneath it. I don't know. He was going to tell me that night. But she had to stop, had to take a breath. They didn't give him the chance. There were 4 of them, all warriors. They said Caleb had committed treason, that he was a threat to the pack's stability. But they weren't there to arrest him, Fenris. They were there to silence him. His hand covered hers on the armrest, and the warmth of his touch steadied her. I ran, she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. I couldn't fight them. I had just discovered the pregnancy, just learned it was quintuplets. Caleb told me to run, told me to find someone who would protect me and the babies, and then Her voice broke. He held them off long enough for me to escape. I could hear him fighting as I ran, and then I heard him stop. Maya. Fenris's voice was rough, and when she looked at him, she saw something fierce and protective burning in his gaze. The wolves who killed your mate, were they among those who pursued you to the border? She nodded, not trusting her voice. Then they're already dead. His jaw was tight, his free hand clenched into a fist on his thigh. My patrol wolves killed 3 Shadowmere warriors that night. But if there are more, if any of them are still out there. There are more. Maya closed her eyes, feeling the familiar weight of fear settling over her. Vance, the Alpha's brother. He led the attack on our cottage, and he swore, as I ran, that he would find me, that he would end Caleb's bloodline forever. She felt Fenris go very still beside her, and when she opened her eyes, she found him staring at her with an intensity that stole her breath. He won't touch you, Fenris said, and his voice resonated with the full weight of his alpha power. He won't touch your children. I swear it on my pack, on my throne, on my life, Maya. No one will hurt you while I draw breath. The bond between them flared, hot and electric, and Maya felt tears prick at her eyes again. She'd spent so long being afraid, being alone, running from shadows that seemed to multiply with each passing day. And now here was this scarred, fierce, impossibly gentle man, offering her something she'd never dared to hope for. Safety, protection, home. Why? She whispered, turning her hand over beneath his so their palms pressed together. Why are you doing all this for me? Fenris was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on their intertwined fingers. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. Because my wolf recognized you the moment you opened your eyes in that healing ward. Because I've spent 5 years alone in this stronghold, convinced that the prophecies about my bloodline meant I was destined to destroy everything I loved. Because for the first time since I lost my mother to my father's madness, I've found something worth fighting for. He raised his eyes to hers, and she saw the raw vulnerability there, the fear he usually kept hidden behind his scars and his power. Because you're my mate, Maya. I knew it that first night, and every moment since has only confirmed it. I would burn the world to ashes to keep you safe. Maya's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. Her wolf was howling with recognition, with longing, with a fierce and desperate need she couldn't silence. Hours. Finally, hours. But the fear was still there too, the memory of what she'd lost, the terror of losing again. I was mated before, she said, her voice trembling, to Caleb. I loved him, Fenris. I know. He brought their joined hands to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. I'm not asking you to forget him. I'm not asking you to stop loving him. I'm asking for a chance to earn my place in your heart alongside the memory of what you had. His golden eyes held hers, steady and sure. Can you give me that, Maya? Can you let me try? She should have said no. Should have pulled away, protected herself. remembered that she barely knew this man, and the world he lived in was full of dangers she didn't understand. But when she opened her mouth to refuse, what came out instead was, yes. The word hung between them like a promise, and Fenris's smile was like the sun breaking through storm clouds. The attack came 3 nights later. Maya had just drifted into an uneasy sleep when she felt it. A wrongness, a pressure in the air that made her wolf snarl with sudden fury. She sat up in bed, her hand going instinctively to her belly, and that was when she heard it. Footsteps in the corridor outside her door. Too many footsteps, and too quiet, moving with the deliberate stealth of predators stalking prey. Her heart slammed against her ribs as she threw back the quilts and struggled to her feet. The babies were kicking frantically, responding to her terror, and she had to brace herself against the bedpost for a moment before she could move. The service entrance, she thought wildly. They came through the service entrance. She'd seen it during the construction, a narrow door in the back of what would become the nursery, connecting to the old kitchens that Fenris had promised to seal off once the wing was complete. But the work wasn't finished yet. And now, the door to her chambers burst open. 3 wolves in human form spilled through, their eyes glowing amber in the darkness, their lips pulled back from teeth that were already lengthening into fangs. And at their head, his face twisted with cruel satisfaction, was Vance. "Hello, widow," he said, and his voice was the same voice that had echoed through her cottage on the night Caleb died. "Did you really think you could hide from us?" Maya's blood turned to ice in her veins as Vance stepped into her chambers, his amber eyes gleaming with predatory satisfaction. Behind him, the 2 Shadowmere wolves fanned out, blocking any escape route, their movements coordinated with the precision of hunters who had tracked their prey for far too long. 7 months, Vance continued, his voice dripping with mockery as he advanced. 7 months we've been searching for you, and here you are, fat with my brother's abominations, hiding behind the Windrider King's walls like the coward you always were. Maya's hand pressed protectively against her belly, feeling her children kick frantically in response to her terror. Her wolf, dormant for so long after Caleb's death, was suddenly snarling inside her chest, but the beast felt weak, uncertain, still recovering from years of grief-induced slumber. "Caleb was worth 10 of you," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. 100 of you, and these children will carry his legacy long after you're nothing but a forgotten stain on Shadowmere history. Vance's face contorted with rage and he lunged forward, grabbing her arm with bruising force. The pain was sharp and immediate, but it was nothing compared to the agony of the contraction that seized her at that moment, her body choosing the worst possible time to remind her that 5 babies were demanding to be born. She cried out, and Vance laughed. "Oh, this is perfect," he breathed, his fetid breath washing over her face. "You're in labor, which means I get to kill Caleb's spawn as they emerge, one by one, while you watch. Poetic, don't you think? He always said you were his greatest treasure. I think he'd appreciate knowing I destroyed you both so thoroughly." Another contraction ripped through her, and Maya doubled over, gasping. The Shadowmere wolves behind Vance were shifting restlessly, their eyes darting toward the door, clearly nervous about being in enemy territory for too long. "Hurry!" one of them growled. "The patrol changes soon. We need to finish this and get out before—" "Before what?" Vance snarled, not releasing his grip on Maya's arm. "Before the scarred king comes to save his new pet? Let him come. I'll gut him too. Vera promised us passage out through the eastern gate. We have time." Vera. The name cut through Maya's pain-fogged mind like a blade. Lady Vera Starfall, with her perfect courtly smiles and her barely concealed hatred. Of course she was the one who had let these monsters into the stronghold. She had been positioning herself as Fenris's queen for years, and Maya's arrival had threatened everything she'd worked for. But there was no time to dwell on betrayal. Another contraction was building, and with it came something else. That strange warmth she'd felt before. The silvery pulse Marin had noticed during her examination, but this time it wasn't subtle. It was blazing through her like liquid fire, fed by her terror and her rage, and the 5 small hearts beating in perfect synchrony with her own. Her wolf was no longer simply snarling. It was rising, awakening with a fury that felt ancient and unstoppable. And it was drawing on something the babies were offering, the ancient silver fire of the moon goddess, the prophesied power that Vera had called cursed. The bloodline that ran through her quintuplets wasn't a curse at all. It was a blessing, a gift passed down through generations of wolves touched by the divine, and it had been waiting for exactly this moment to awaken. "Let go of me," Maya said, and her voice sounded different, layered with a resonance she'd never heard before. Vance blinked, his grip loosening for just a fraction of a second. "What did you—" I said, "Let go." The power exploded out of her without conscious thought, a blast of silver light that erupted from her skin and sent Vance flying backward into the wall. He hit with a sickening crunch, and the 2 wolves behind him stumbled, their eyes wide with shock and sudden fear. Maya stood at the center of the light, her hands pressed to her belly, her entire body thrumming with energy she didn't understand but refused to question. Her children were still kicking, still fighting, and she would be damned if she let Vance touch a single hair on their heads. "You killed my husband," she said, and each word rang with power that made the walls shake. "You burned my home. You hunted me across territories, forced me to run when I should have been nesting, should have been preparing for my children's arrival in peace and safety." Vance was struggling to rise, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead, his amber eyes now wide with unmistakable fear. "What are you?" he gasped. "I'm their mother." Maya took a step forward and the silver light flared brighter. "And I'm done running." She didn't know what would have happened next, whether she would have been able to maintain the power, whether it would have consumed her along with her enemies. Because at that moment, the door behind the Shadowmere wolves exploded inward. Fenris came through like a force of nature, his wolf already half emerged, his hands curved into claws that gleamed in the silver light. He took in the scene in an instant, Maya glowing like a fallen star, Vance bleeding against the wall, the 2 wolves turning to face this new threat, and his roar shook the foundations of the room. The battle was brief and brutal. Fenris was faster than she'd ever seen him, his movements a blur of lethal precision as he tore through the Shadowmere wolves. One fell with his throat torn out dead before he hit the ground. The other tried to flee through the shattered door and made it perhaps 3 steps before Fenris caught him and snapped his neck with a single violent twist. Then there was only Vance, cowering against the wall, his earlier bravado completely vanished in the face of an Alpha King's fury. "Please," he whimpered. "Please. I was just following orders. The Alpha demanded it. Caleb was asking too many questions about the pack's finances, threatening to expose everything. I didn't want to kill my own brother, but they said it was him or me, and I just wanted to prove I could be valuable to the pack." "What needed to be finished?" Fenris's voice was barely human, a growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You murdered an innocent man. You terrorized his pregnant mate. You broke into my stronghold and threatened to kill 5 unborn children." He stalked forward, and even Maya, despite everything Vance had done, felt a flicker of something like pity at the abject terror on his face. "You know what I think, Vance," Fenris continued, his claws extending fully. "I think your pack is better off without you. I think the world is better off without you. And I think you're about to discover exactly what happens to wolves who threaten what's mine." "Wait." Maya's voice cut through the room and Fenris paused, turning to look at her with golden eyes that still blazed with protective fury. "He needs to stand trial," she said, the silver light finally beginning to fade as exhaustion crept in at the edges of her consciousness. in front of both packs. So everyone knows what Shadowmere did, what they've been doing. So there's no question about justice. Fenris stared at her for a long moment, and she could see the war playing out behind his eyes, the desire to end this now, to eliminate the threat permanently, versus the wisdom of what she was asking. Please, she added softly, I need to see him face consequences. Real consequences. Not just death, but disgrace. I need everyone to know that Caleb died a hero and Vance lived as a coward. Slowly, Fenris nodded. He turned back to Vance, reached down, and hauled him up by the throat with one hand. You'll live, he said, his voice dripping with contempt. For now. Because my mate has requested it. But pray, to whatever gods you believe in, that the trial comes quickly. Because every moment you spend breathing my air is a moment I spend imagining all the ways I could end you. He slammed Vance against the wall once more for good measure, then tossed him toward the guards who had finally arrived in the corridor. Chain him in the deepest cell we have, double the guard. If he so much as blinks wrong, put him down. Then he was at Maya's side, his claws retracting, his hands infinitely gentle as they cupped her face. Are you hurt? Did he? I'm fine, she managed, though another contraction was building and the room was starting to spin. But Fenris, the babies are coming. Right now, She didn't get to finish the sentence before her knees buckled and darkness swallowed her whole. Maya woke to the sound of crying. Not one cry, but 5. A chorus of tiny voices rising and falling in the dimness of the healing ward. Her body felt hollowed out, scraped clean, rebuilt from the inside. There was pain, but it was distant, muted by something that she suspected was very powerful medicine. Easy. Fenris's voice was warm and rough beside her ear. You're safe. The babies are safe. Everything is all right. She turned her head and found him sitting in the chair beside her bed, looking more exhausted than she'd ever seen him. His clothing was still blood-stained, his face was drawn with worry lines that seemed to have deepened overnight, and he was cradling the smallest bundle she'd ever seen against his broad chest. 5, he said, and his voice cracked on the word. 5 perfect, healthy, impossible children, 3 girls, 2 boys. Born weeks early, and yet Marin says they're as strong as full-term pups, stronger even. The silver fire, the ancient power of the moon goddess's bloodline, it protected them through the birth. Protected you too. Marin says she's only read about such power in the oldest texts, the ones that speak of wolves blessed to carry the goddess's light. Tears were streaming down Maya's face before she even realized she was crying. Can I see them? The next hour was a blur of tiny fingers and tinier toes, of soft, downy heads and eyes that wouldn't stay open long enough for her to determine their color. The healers brought each baby to her one by one, and she memorized every detail. The birthmark on the firstborn girl's left shoulder, the way the second boy already seemed to have his father's stubborn chin, the impossibly delicate curve of the youngest girl's ears. Her children, Caleb's children. And Fenris sat beside her through all of it, never leaving, never looking away, his scarred face soft with awe and tenderness, and what might have been fear. Vera has been arrested, he said quietly, after the 5th baby had been placed in her bassinet, and the healers had finally retreated to give them privacy. She confessed to everything. Letting the Shadowmere wolves through the eastern gate, poisoning the court against you, even. He stopped, his jaw tightening. Even what? Even sabotaging the construction on the nursery wing. She paid one of the workers to leave the service entrance unsealed. She wanted this to happen, Maya. She wanted you dead and the babies destroyed so I would have no reason not to choose her. Maya felt sick. What will happen to her? Exile. Permanent, irrevocable exile beyond our borders. Her house will be dissolved, her name struck from pack records. Her lands distributed among the families of the wolves she helped murder. She'll spend the rest of her life knowing that everything she worked for, everything she sacrificed her honor for, was taken away because of her own jealousy. It wasn't death. Part of Maya, a dark, vengeful part she hadn't known existed, wished it was. But the rational part of her understood that this was worse. Vera Starfall had valued nothing more than her status, her position, her proximity to power. Taking all of that away was a more fitting punishment than a quick execution. And Vance? His trial is tomorrow. The evidence is overwhelming. Every pack leader in the territory will witness his confession, and then... Fenris's hands curled into fists. Then I will carry out the sentence myself. Maya nodded slowly. Justice, finally. For Caleb. For their children. For everything that had been taken from her. There's something else I need to tell you, Fenris said, and his voice had changed, become softer, almost uncertain. Something I should have said earlier, before the attack, before everything went wrong. Maya looked up at him, and the vulnerability in his golden eyes stole her breath. The prophecy about my bloodline, he continued. It said that I would destroy everything I loved if I ruled alone. My father interpreted that to mean I should never love anything, never allow myself attachments that could become weaknesses. He thought the prophecy was about strength through isolation. He reached out and took her hand, his thumb stroking gently over her knuckles. But I think he was wrong. I think the prophecy was a warning and a promise. If I ruled alone, if I shut myself away from connection, from love, from the things that make life worth fighting for, I would become something monstrous, something destructive. But if I found my mate, if I let myself love, then you wouldn't be alone, Maya finished softly, and the prophecy wouldn't apply. You're my salvation, Maya. His voice was rough with emotion. You and those 5 impossible miracles you just brought into the world. I've spent years hiding from a future I thought was inevitable, and then you collapsed at my border stones and everything changed. He slid from the chair to his knees beside her bed, and Maya felt her heart stop as he looked up at her with eyes that shimmered gold. I want to mark you, he said. I want to claim you as my mate, as my Luna, as the queen of everything I am and everything I have. But only if you want it too. Only if you're ready. Maya's wolf, fully awakened now and thrumming with power she was still learning to understand, howled its approval. But it was her human heart that answered, the part of her that had spent months grieving and running and slowly, painfully learning to hope again. Yes, she whispered, just as she had that night in the corridor. But this time, the word carried the weight of everything she felt. The love that had grown in the spaces between fear and protection, the trust that had built with every gentle touch and fierce defense, the certainty that this was exactly where she was meant to be. Fenris rose from his knees and sat on the edge of her bed, his movements careful, conscious of her still healing body. His hand came up to cup her face, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone, and Maya felt the mate bond between them pulse with anticipation. It will hurt at first, he murmured, but only for a moment, and then... He shuddered, his eyes falling closed. Then you'll feel everything I feel for you. Every single thing I've been too afraid to say. Maya tilted her head, exposing the junction of her neck and shoulder, offering herself to him without hesitation. I'm ready. His breath caught. For a long moment he simply looked at her, drinking in the sight of her surrender, her trust. Then he bent his head, and she felt the brush of his lips against her throat, the sharp scrape of teeth that had lengthened into fangs. Mine, he growled against her skin. The bite was pain and fire and lightning all at once. Maya cried out, her fingers digging into his shoulders, her body arching toward him even as every nerve ending screamed at the intrusion. His teeth sank deep, breaking skin, and she felt his claim brand itself into her very soul. And then the pain transformed. It became warmth, spreading from the wound through her entire body like honey and sunlight and the first day of spring. The mate bond that had hummed between them since that first moment in the healing ward roared open like a river breaking through a dam, and suddenly she could feel him, really feel him, every emotion laid bare. Love, overwhelming and fierce and absolutely unwavering. Fear, the terror of losing her that had driven him to tear apart 3 wolves with his bare hands. Hope, fragile and new and growing stronger with every beat of their now synchronized hearts. Fenris pulled back from the bite, his tongue tracing gently over the wound to seal it, and when he raised his head, his eyes were filled with tears. "Maya," he breathed, "my Maya, my mate." But she wasn't finished. Before he could say anything else, she reached up and fisted her hand in his hair, pulling him down to her level. Her own wolf was surging forward, demanding something that Maya had never known she needed until this very moment. "My turn," she said, and her voice was layered with power that made Fenris's eyes widen. She felt his shock through the bond, followed immediately by a wave of pure, incandescent joy as she pressed her mouth to the scarred column of his throat. Her teeth elongated, her wolf lending her the strength she needed, and then she bit. Fenris groaned, a sound that seemed torn from the very depths of his soul as her claim sank into him. She felt the mate bond complete itself, the 2 halves finally becoming whole, and what flowed through that completed connection was beyond anything she could have imagined. His memories, the loneliness of 5 years ruling without a queen, the despair when he'd believed the prophecy doomed him to destruction, the moment he'd walked into the healing ward and felt his entire world realign around the woman lying unconscious in the bed. His hopes, a future filled with children's laughter and midnight feedings and a mate who challenged him and completed him in equal measure. His love, vast and deep and terrifying in its intensity, given freely and completely and without any expectation of return. Maya released his throat and fell back against the pillows, gasping for breath, tears streaming down her face. Fenris collapsed beside her, pulling her into his arms with shaking hands, and for a long moment they simply held each other. "Mine," she whispered against his chest. "Yours," he answered, his voice rough with emotion. "Mate." The word hung between them like a vow, and Maya felt the settled bond hum with contentment. She was marked. She was claimed. She was finally, irrevocably, impossibly home. The coronation took place 1 month later, beneath a full moon that seemed to shine brighter than any Maya had ever seen. She stood at the center of the great courtyard, Fenris at her side, both of them dressed in the traditional white and silver of the Windrider pack. Before them, arranged in 5 matching bassinets, their children slept peacefully, all except the youngest girl, who had inherited Caleb's stubborn streak and, if Maya was being honest, seemed to have already picked up Fenris's fierce watchfulness. The gathered crowd was larger than any Maya had seen since arriving at the stronghold. Pack members from all corners of the territory had come to witness their alpha king take a queen, and mixed among them were representatives from allied packs who had heard the story of the impossible mother and her miraculous children. Vance's trial had been swift and brutal. He'd confessed to everything: Caleb's murder, the months of pursuit, the attack in the nursery, and Fenris had carried out the sentence personally, ensuring that the wolf who had terrorized Maya for so long would never threaten anyone again. The Shadowmere Pack, stripped of its leadership and facing dissolution, had sued for peace. The terms were still being negotiated, but Maya had made one thing absolutely clear. Any wolf who had participated in the hunt for her and her children would face justice. There would be no forgiveness for those crimes. Now, as the moon reached its zenith, Fenris raised his voice to address the assembled crowd. "Tonight, we celebrate not one miracle, but 6, he said, and his voice carried across the courtyard with the full weight of his alpha power. My mate, Maya Darkhollow Windrider, who survived the unsurvivable, and our children." He paused, letting the words settle over the crowd. "Whom I have formally adopted by blood oath and pack law, who carry both their birth father Caleb's legacy and my protection, and who will lead the future of this pack as my own heirs." He turned to Maya, and the love in his eyes was so bright it almost hurt to look at. "Maya, before these witnesses, I name you Luna Queen of the Windrider pack, my partner, my equal, my chosen mate for all the days of my life. Will you accept this crown and the responsibility that comes with it?" Maya looked out at the crowd, at the healers who had saved her life, at the guards who had protected her, at the thousands of faces that would now look to her for guidance. She thought of Caleb, of the life they had dreamed of building together, and she felt no guilt for the joy that filled her heart. He would want this for her. He would want her to be happy, to be safe, to be loved. "I accept," she said, and her voice rang clear and strong across the courtyard. "With all my heart and all my strength, I accept." The crown that settled on her brow was silver and moonstones, lighter than she'd expected but heavy with meaning. The crowd erupted in cheers, and beside her, the youngest Windrider princess opened her eyes and made a sound that was probably supposed to be a cry, but came out more like a tiny, imperious demand for attention. Maya laughed, scooping her daughter up and cradling her against her chest, and Fenris wrapped his arm around them both. Later, in the quiet of the nursery wing he had built for her, now filled with 5 sleeping children and an entire staff devoted to their care, Maya stood by the window and watched the moon sink toward the horizon. Fenris came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, and she leaned back into his warmth. "Are you happy?" he murmured against her hair. Maya touched the mark on her throat, feeling the bond pulse with shared contentment. Through it, she could sense his heartbeat, steady and sure, and beneath that, the unwavering love that had become as essential to her as breathing. "I'm home," she said simply. And for the first time in a very long time, she meant it. The Windrider stronghold had gained a Luna, a queen, a mother of miracles. And Maya Darkhollow Windrider, who had once fled through a winter storm with nothing but the children growing inside her, had finally found the place where she belonged. Forever.